In this video, I'm going to introduce you to the concept of exceptions. What are exceptions, first of all? Well, an exception is an object. An object is a key word here. That's something we're learning and getting more and more comfortable with. That represents an error or condition that prevents execution from proceeding normally. This is something we've been working with all along and didn't really know what we were doing because we just rolled with it and didn't really understand it. So an exception is, for example, when the JVM detects an operation that it can't carry out. For example, here we have this numerator divided by a 0. Well, we all know what happens when we try and run that code, right? We get this error on our console. So it's an exception. It's something that the JVM couldn't handle, didn't know what to do with, and so the program terminated and sent up the error message on our console. So this actually is an object. It's an exception object. So when we have something that is an object, that indicates to us that we have an error that has methods and things that we can do with it. And we'll look at these methods here in a little bit. There's several things that you can do to catch or to deal with an exception. One is do nothing at all. So if you do nothing at all with that division by 0, for example, we have some code here. The user has the ability to put in a 0 in the denominator. And if we don't do anything about it, we all know what's going to happen. We get this runtime error that gives us that message. So that's one way to handle it. Another way we can handle it is we've done this before where we've written some kind of condition. We've written some kind of decision or loop to make sure that they don't enter that error, that offending error. So in this case, we can keep them in the loop until they do not enter a denominator. Once they enter in a valid number, then we can do the expression that, so we don't get that runtime error and the program doesn't halt in the middle of it. So that's another way we can handle it. But exception handling is kind of a more elegant way to deal with errors, and we'll get a little bit more complicated as we move along. So let's look at the exception class to start with. Well, everything, when we've been learning this, everything in Java inherits from the root object class. So exceptions are an object whose super parent is the object, okay? So from there, throwable is an object. It's the root object of all of our exceptions. And throwable has some of these methods that we can inherit when we have exceptions. And we'll look at what some of these methods do. So throwable is the superclass of all of our exceptions. And we'll look at, and it's a subclass of object. Okay, so we'll look at a little bit more of this as we progress here. All right, so under the parent throwable, we have two children, exceptions and errors. So these are two subclasses of exceptions that we can encounter. The exception class is where we'll be playing today. The exception class is less serious errors, like our runtime errors. Anything in the exception class are things that you as the programmer, you should be able to catch and do something with. And we'll see more examples of that in a minute. So we have the ability as programmers to deal with these exceptions and handle them in such a way so it doesn't cause some problems for the JVM. On the other side of the coin is the error class. And error classes usually are things like the system running out of memory or things that we can't really recover from in the midst of the program. So if we're lucky, we can catch it and throw up some kind of error to our, or some kind of message to our user, but we really can't recover. We're not going to be able to fix it during, in the process of the code running. Okay, so we're going to look at this class, which is a child of exception, and these are our runtime errors. And these are things that we've been encountering all the time in our code. Null pointer exceptions. So if we are trying to access an object that we haven't provided a variable for. Or maybe we have, we're trying to get to an array subscript or array element that is past the amount of elements that we've accounted for. All these kinds of things are division by zero. So the runtime exceptions are just those. Those are things that we've encountered as coders in this class, most likely, during runtime. For example, the division by zero. So when we see this error message, this division by zero error message, notice here is the arithmetic exception. And so that is a class, which is a child of the runtime exception. So there's multiple classes that'll be underneath here, and this is one we've seen. And so when we didn't handle this error, this exception in the code, and it got sent to the console, we see an error message telling us which exception was the problem. And then we have this sort of English message that tries to give us an idea of what happened. So we call this, so this is just our hierarchy, so to speak. Arithmetic exception extends runtime or inherits from the runtime exception and all the way up the line. We call this value is thrown. So we throw an exception. That's the term that we use. Well, because it extends from the throwable, probably is where that came from. So an exception is thrown, and we can throw an exception from one place to another. We'll see examples of that as we progress. We can throw an error from method to method. We can do lots of things to catch that thrown error until it gets to the JVM. So we'll look at that. So this is how we can catch or test for errors. We call this a try-catch block. And we'll look at this more in detail, but here is a try block. And in the try block, we will run, let's just look at the next slide here. In the try block, these are statements that we want to test to see if it's going to throw an error. In other words, we could put that division, numerator divided by denominator, in this statement to see if it will work or if it'll throw an error. So the first part of this try-catch block is the try. And you have to have a catch with the try. So these two are a complete block. You need the try, braces, your statements, and then the catch. And how does the catch work? Well, the catch is, never mind. The catch is that if our try fails, we're going to catch that exception in this block. So the word exception is the class that we're trying to catch. In our example prior, the arithmetic exception would be the word here. And some exception, this is just a variable name that we give it so that we can have reference to the exception object and can do things with it here in this block of code. After the try runs and the catch runs, the statements will continue on and whatever's after this block will work. So I'll show you more examples of that in the next video. This just gives us an overview of exceptions, what they are, that they're objects, and how we can test for them to be thrown, and then catch them so that we can do something with it. So let's look at how that's all going to work together in code.